What is going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel. So in this video, I did want to have a discussion for a big map versus a small map and basically go over like the positives and negatives of both of them. Now I'm going to say right off the bat that we can obviously say a bigger map is the better option, but also if the smaller map is going to be packed, then yes, that could be better. But I really do feel like there's going to be so many factors that play into this. So the first thing I'm going to talk about here is going to be the big map. First thing I have to say right now, guys, one of my favorite things about a big map personally is, well, you obviously will have a lot of room for them to add content and different things to that map because there's so many things there. And they can probably go to a bunch of different areas, add like a race here, or, add like a new location to that place because the map is so large that it really isn't going to mess it up. This is probably something we are most likely going to see pretty common in the Crew 2 before, to where you obviously see something like Miami or New York. And on top of that, though, we have places like Detroit, LA, and we also have something like Las Vegas. So there is going to be a lot of different places that are in the said map because it is so large. Now, this is obviously an example of just the Crew 2. Like, don't get me wrong, I do know other racing games have bigger maps, or at least they are going to be larger. Do let me know in the comments below, was the Crew 2 the biggest map for a racing game ever? I'm not 100% sure if it was. I don't know. I do know, like, Test Drive Unlimited 2's map was pretty dang big back in the day, so I am kind of interested in how both of those maps do actually compare to each other. But the big thing about a big map, though, guys, as I mentioned before, is yes, it is obviously massive. One of my favorite things about a large map, though, is they will have no issues adding content to it. Now, I do know in some ways this probably could be argued to the fact that you don't actually have to have a big map to have it loaded with content. Like, you can have a small map being loaded with stuff to do something like Forza Horizon 4. At least I have heard the older Forza Horizons have had a lot of stuff to do. Let me know if Forza Horizon 5 is the same way. I don't know because I haven't played it. But I do know a lot of players can argue that yes, a smaller map can be packed. I will get into that here in a second. But here's the thing I have to mention, though. A big map is going to have one large advantage over everything else. That is going to come down to the fact that they can easily add a bunch of content to that said map, and there's still going to be a ton of untouched areas all around it, where they can also add even more stuff to it. A great example, again, guys, is going to be the Crew 2 here. For one, we obviously have the USST races around different cities. That was a really cool idea, like blocking off certain areas for that. Then we also had like the regular taxi missions being added on like each city or like many roads that you cruise on. And then we also had like the off-road ones being added to where I think it was like an animal that you delivered. At least something like that, I think. But it's just really cool though because there's so many areas they could add stuff into it to where you always feel like there is something to do even though the map is massive. And also, guys, one last thing I have to throw into there. This might sound kind of dumb, but I have to mention this though. When looking at something like even Detroit, for example, which is obviously a small city that was in the Crew 2, similar to something like Miami and Las Vegas, but besides that though, when looking at a small city, if they wanted to add a new race into it, let's say a drift event, for example, they can go into that small area of Detroit and go, okay, cut this area out, cut that out, and boom, there's a new drift area. That is dope. And the cool part about that though is having a bigger map designed from the get-go like that is going to allow them to actually add events into the map itself without having to completely change things around or add something into the map to make that said event work. Now flipping that around though, having a larger map probably won't be as much work adding something like an event into a said area instead of adding like an entire thing onto the map because the area isn't big enough in general. This can be seen on like some of the drift events in Motorfest to where it's going to be a tower like some weird floating thing, which I'm guessing that way was probably the best way they could have done it for a few reasons. Number one, they obviously could have put that in like one of these cities like Honolulu or something, but we all do know there's already going to be a lot of events in that said city already, so like why add another drift event on top of the same areas of the other events? So we might as well add like a tower, that way it's going to be slightly different. If we look at something like the Crew 2, we have airports and all kinds of open areas to where they could be like, alright bro, let's block off a random area in this airport and boom, we have a drift event. Like, it's just so much easier to do stuff like that, and I just feel like having a bigger map really is easier to add content to it in that aspect. Now, the other thing I have to admit though is I love having a bigger map for another example. That is going to be having larger races being around 10, 15, even 20 minutes long. Don't get me wrong though, like I do like around the world and stuff like that in something like Need for Speed Heat, like the Discovery events, or something like having a longer event even in Motorfest would be fun. We do have like the Liberty territory, but you know what? Make the event a little bit longer, man. I just feel like it would be a little better if it was around 15 to 20 minutes. But obviously the big thing there is to make the events pay out more if they are going to be longer. I feel like seeing the events in the Crew 2 compared to Motorfest being longer in that game, also they paid a lot more being around the same time as the Liberty territory. Something ain't mathin' right there, bro. It really isn't. Now I did want to talk about a few of the negative things about a larger map. Obviously the biggest one here people can't agree with is, well, that is probably going to be the graphics on that said map not being that great. And this is probably going to be a fairly obvious thing on a big map because you obviously have to focus on getting the graphics good enough, or at least being able to run on a PlayStation 5, even a PS4, and obviously running on a PC without crashing out or having issues. So they're probably going to have to sacrifice a few things if the map is obviously massive, whether some of the textures not loading in right, the car sounds not being 100%, and even some of the things like the handling and stuff being a bit wonky. That is all probably going to play a big factor in something with a map that large. I mean, being able to run that, guys, I would say a lot of games can crash out, have issues as I mentioned, so I would probably say there is going to be a few negatives there. And of course, one of the other things is obviously some of these servers being a bit janky and stuff like that because obviously the map is huge. Trying to load everything in, load the players in, load the textures, load the vehicles, the upgrades on the vehicles, and so on. It could probably get a bit wonky there, and that can definitely be a pretty big negative of having a larger map. Now, before I start talking about the small map, though, there's one question I have to ask you guys, though. What is your favorite map out of any racing game ever made? This can be legit any racing game ever. This can be legit your favorite racing game map that was ever made in basically any racing game, or what do you think was the best racing game map that was ever created? I am curious to know what you guys think about this in the comments below. But now we are going to talk about the small map and some of the positives and negatives of those. First thing here, I'm going to mention some of the positives. Number one, guys, we could say this right now, the graphics and all that of the map is probably going to be beautiful. Don't get me wrong, Motorfest is a gorgeous map. I love the coloring of it, and the overall aesthetics of that map really are going to be beautiful, especially on a sunrise or even a sunset. Like, I love how it looks, man. I can't even lie about that. We all do know a smaller map, they can once again focus on stuff like graphics. If you were trying to have the graphics of Motorfest in the Crew 2 map, that would probably require a crazy amount of hardware to be able to do that. And let's be real though, a lot of the other things would most likely suffer trying to have graphics that great. So I would probably say it's going to be a win-win or even a lose-lose trying to do that. So I guess having a smaller map, they can focus on things like that with it. You can also do something like the handling model being better because of the way the map's a bit smaller. You can also have something like the car sounds being a lot better, which I know players love it. We can all agree right now, Motorfest car sounds are better than the Crew 2, man. Like, that's obviously a fact. We can all agree that the driving animations on Motorfest are also better, whereas they once again can focus on things like that with the map being a lot tinier. Now, when looking at the Motorfest map compared to the Crew 2's map, there is going to be a few things that definitely jump out to me. Number one, I would say right now, guys, as I mentioned before with the Crew 2's map is, yes, they can obviously add events literally everywhere. The cool part about that is every single event is going to be in a different area. That is also probably going to be in a different place to where you can explore it, and the race isn't going to feel almost like it's in the exact same location. If we look at something like Motorfest, for example, many of the events basically overlap each other, and obviously some are better than others, so many of those better quote-unquote events are probably going to show up in summits a lot more often, which we are currently seeing a lot in the game at the moment. Like, a lot of the events in the summits, I jump in, I'm like, oh, okay, this event again, I just did this one 2 weeks ago, I just did this race last week, but they changed the name of the thing, maybe around the theme just a tad bit, making it nighttime or raining or something, but it's the exact same event. Now, the other thing about that though is we also are going to go over the exact same areas. As I was mentioning before, like the drift cars having like the towers or something like that, we are now going to have drift events being on the map itself. Now, the issue with this though is going on those areas, you're like, okay, let's drift. The cool thing about that is, yes, you're obviously in a drift car, so it's different. But the thing is, though, you're still driving on the same roads you were just previously on with a different car. Because the map is only so big and the events are probably going to overlap each other, and you are most likely going to keep going on the exact same roads over and over. Now, I also have to admit this right now, I'm not saying it's going to be a terrible design, because obviously doing the exact same races with different vehicles is probably going to have a different outcome. I mean, each car is going to have different speed, different handling, most likely a different feeling to it. So yes, doing the same events might actually be pretty dang fun, but also in the same way though, if that's going to be the main end game part of it, a lot of players are most likely going to get bored of doing those races all the time. At least in the Crew 2, there were so many races you can do in them. They also added all kinds of events in different parts of the map, and it really was always going to be a new experience because of how large the map was. You always felt like you were going to a new location, or like you did some races in one place, and you're like, oh yeah, let's go back over there. And wait a minute, man, I did not even know this road was here. It's kind of hilarious getting back on the Crew 2 and driving around a bit. You actually will find roads you have never been on before, man. That is so dope. Whereas in Motorfest, I would say at this point, everybody has probably been on every road at least 10 to 20 times at least, or even more for that matter. I really do hope the new map being added is going to take away some of this though, and it is most likely going to add a new aspect to the game with new areas in it. And I really do hope right now, guys, that the new map isn't going to suffer from the exact same issue. For example, adding a bunch of new events on that tiny map because it is new. We all do know a lot of players want to play on the new map. I mean, that is probably going to be fairly obvious after being on Oahu for a year straight for that matter. So a lot of players might look at Maui and go, oh yeah bro, a new area, let's go to it. And I do know a lot of players, including myself, are massively excited to drive around on the new Maui map that's being added. But guys, there's going to be one concern I have to mention. Does anyone else think that players are all going to flock to Maui and most likely play on it because it's obviously a new place? I mean, I'm probably going to do the same thing. But do you guys also think players might actually get bored playing on Maui the entire time, and they're probably not going to want to go back to Oahu? I mean, I have been thinking about this a bit. I don't know if that's going to happen, but I do feel like a lot of players are most likely going to be on Maui the entire time when it's out, and they are most likely going to kind of forget about Oahu. So who knows, maybe they might end up playing on Maui so much that they're going to be like, oh yeah, we also have Oahu, and then boom, it's basically going to be like a new map all over again. At least I think that might be possible. But do let me know what y'all think about this in the comments below. What do you guys think is going to be better and why, and what do you think are some of the big positives of a big map compared to a small map, and vice versa?